Chapter 15, Part 1 of Mounted Police Life in Canada. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Mounted Police Life in Canada by Captain Burton Dean. Chapter 15, Wholesale Cattle Smuggling. In the month of November 1901, the Collector of United States Customs at Great Falls, in the state of Montana, a place about 140 miles south of Lethbridge, wrote to me to ask what brands the firm of Spencer Brothers were using in Canada, and whether they had any cattle branded with a double rowlock. I was aware that these people were American citizens who had recently leased from the Dominion government a large quantity of land. They were reputed to be wealthy, and to have a great number of very fine cattle. Beyond that my attention had not been particularly directed to them. I now learned that the firm consisted of two brothers, Samuel and John, that they were intensely unpopular in the state of Montana, and that they had conceived the brilliant idea of coming to northwest Canada and leasing a large quantity of land at 2 cents an acre in the immediate proximity of the international boundary. William Taylor, their manager, is my authority for the statement that a sum of money had been set down in the Canadian estimates for the year 1902 for the purpose of building a fence along the international boundary line. The project was not carried into effect, but that such a ridiculous proposition had even been taken into serious consideration shows what influence the Spencer Brothers had with the government at Ottawa. The diagram herewith shows a plan of the lease, namely, Townships No. 1 in Ranges 5 and 6, and Townships No. 2 in Ranges 6, 7 and 8. As each township measures 6 miles north and south by 6 miles east and west, and consists of 36 square miles, it follows that the firm had 180 square miles of the public domain under lease. But this was not all the advantage they derived, for a glance at the map will show how the leased land bestrides the Milk River, which flows out of Canada into Montana in Township 1, Range 5. The Spencers thus controlled at least 24 miles of river frontage, and as there was no other water within striking distance, it is evident that Townships 1 of Ranges 7 and 8 would be of no use to any stock owner who might be denied access to the Milk River. The Spencers thus virtually acquired 72 additional square miles of grazing land, for which they paid not a cent. Everyone will admit that this was a long-headed scheme which deserved to succeed, but it must not be imagined that such extensive privileges could be obtained for the mere asking. Not at all. The Minister of the Interior of that day, who had control of the Dominion lands, was Mr. Clifford Sifton, who, prior to his joining Sir Wilfrid Laurier's cabinet in 1896, had practised law in Brandon, Manitoba. When the brothers Spencer coveted the concessions which have been described, they were astute enough to reason that it might be to their advantage to do their legal business through the firm of lawyers which Mr. Sifton had ostensibly left. Results prove that their line of reasoning was unimpeachable. They had to pay a large sum of money, it is true, but they got what they wanted, and the game was worth the candle. A few years later, another American firm, the Price Conrad Company, desired similarly to milk the good old Canadian cow, and used the same milking stool. The concessions they wanted were near Maple Creek. Their idea was to lease detached townships here and there, selected in such a way as to give them practical control of the intervening area for nothing. The emissary whom they sent eastward to pull the strings wired from Ottawa to his principal at Maple Creek, "We can get it, but it comes high," to which the immediate answer was returned, "Must have it at any price." They got it, and it was the emissary who told the story. Following the examples of the Spencers, other American cattlemen had driven their herds to the Canadian frontier in order that they might fatten on Canadian grass, of which there was an abundance, while the feed to the south of the line was eaten off, and a special officer of customs was detailed to attend to the matter. Having no means himself of watching a long boundary line, he was perforce dependent upon us for information and assistance, his own participation being confined to making out the seizure papers and reporting to Ottawa. He made some seizures during my tenure of command at Maple Creek between July 1902 and July 1906, and, except in one instance where the owner had not apparently learned the tricks of the trade, and had, in consequence, to pay a penalty, the cattle were ordered to be returned by the department at Ottawa without payment of duty. There was no earthly reason why they should not all have been treated alike, but so it was. To hark back to my correspondence with the Collector of U.S. Customs, I learned from him that in November 1901 the Spencers had shipped a trainload of cattle, 176 head, from their Milk River ranch to the Chicago market. This shipment was intercepted by the U.S. Customs officer held at St. Paul while en route to Chicago, and not permitted to proceed to its destination until after the Spencers had deposited the sum of $2,355 with the Secretary of the Montana Stock Growers' Association as customs duty. In November 1900 the brothers had informed the Secretary of the Northern Montana Roundup Association that they had moved all their cattle into Canada, and on that account declined to pay their pro rata share of the Montana roundup expenses. I saw the letters of both brothers, and took copies of them. An indictment which the United States brought against the firm in March 1902 failed because only 10 instead of 12 jurors of the grand jury voted for it. A special agent of the United States Treasury Department was sent from Tacoma to take charge of the case, and the authorities were very much chagrined at having been outwitted. Great influence had been brought to bear upon the jurymen. The Grand Sovereign of the Independent Order of Oddfellows was very active in the interests of the Spencers, whose success emboldened them to think that Canadian justice could be similarly tampered with. Sam Spencer had a favourite expression, "We'll law them," and he was never averse to going to the law. As the United States officials pursued their investigation, they came across a great deal of evidence which was most valuable to me, and they gave me without stint all the assistance which they possibly could. For instance, on April 25, 1900, the firm imported and paid duty on 527 calves, all less than 12 months old. My American friends obtained from me an affidavit from one of the Spencers' employees, who assisted to drive about 1,000 head of cattle to the Canadian frontier. The 527 calves were there cut out of the bunch, and were driven to a mounted police detachment called Writing on Stone, where duty was paid on them, and the mothers were driven to the Spencers' range, where the calves subsequently joined them. The same man also gave information as to another drive of about 800, which took place in October of the same year, and as to the particulars of that I was enabled to procure an affidavit from another employee of the Spencers who took part in the importation. In addition to this, every stockman in northern Montana was eager to give us information, and we had an abundance of it. This ebullition of the feeling against the Spencers on the part of their fellow countrymen was brought about as follows. Ever since they had been established on their Milk River lease, the firm, relying on their influence at Ottawa, had assumed that they could do as they pleased. During the winter of 1901 a great many American cattle had drifted into Canada. The range in northern Montana had been largely burnt off by prairie fires, and the only feed available for some 15,000 head of cattle was in the neighbourhood of the Sweet Grass Hills, where the grass was good, and the stockmen concerned had no choice but to range their cattle there or let them starve to death. This meant that the cattle must be pastured within a latitude of about 20 miles of the Canadian frontier. Within that distance there was no water readily accessible except that in the Milk River, which meandered eastward at a distance of from 10 to 12 miles north of the boundary line. I had always recognised the fact that it was a sheer impossibility to hold thirsty range cattle back from water, and had always impressed upon the owners of trespassing cattle that they should do their utmost to prevent their animals from crossing to the northern bank. There were at that time no Canadian settlers on the south side of the river to be inconvenienced by incursions of stray cattle. The American cattlemen recognised their obligation to protect Canadian interests on the northern bank, and were in the habit of maintaining line riders to keep the cattle back. These men used to lodge at our detachment buildings, and in return for their board and lodging used to keep the Mounted Police detachments supplied with fresh beef at the expense of their employers. This system had been established by me years previously, and had been then fully reported upon and explained in my annual report for the information of Parliament. The revenue suffered to the extent that no duty was charged or paid on any animal so killed for food, and the Customs officers, who were fully aware of the circumstances, and never disdained to partake of the beef when their business took them into those parts, never thought proper to raise the question. In the exercise of their assumed prerogative, Spencer Brothers arrogated to themselves the right to control a large stretch of prairie about 70 miles long by 20 miles wide, and on one occasion, during the winter of 1901, they gathered some 2,000 head of American cattle which had been storm driven to the northern bank of the river, and drove them across to the south side. One of the American cowboy line riders, George Voice, was present, and pointed out that the ice was rotten. He vigorously protested against the proposed movement, but the Spencers' manager said he did not care, he would drive them across no matter what might happen, and he and his men did so. Fortunately, more by good luck than good management, there were no casualties, but the indignant cowboy told the story far and wide in northern Montana, and there was not a cattle owner there who was not anxious to get back at the Spencers, their renegade countrymen. Hence it was that I was able to collect so much information, and the report which I was able to make to my department was as full and conclusive as it was possible for a report to be. The reply of the Customs Department at Ottawa was to send a special service officer to co-operate with me. His instructions were to inform the firm of Spencer Brothers that they were charged with having smuggled into Canada about 500 head of cattle in April, 1900, that the duty paid value of these would be about $15,000, and he was to demand payment of a deposit of $7,500, subject to the final decision of the Minister of Customs. If the firm consented to pay this demand, the officer was to wire to his minister for further instructions. Accordingly, on Good Friday, 1902, Mr. Bourronat and I started by train for Coutts, a station on the boundary line, and from there by road eastward about 55 miles to a mounted police detachment situate in Pendant d'Oriel Coulee, within about 7 miles of the Spencers' ranch. Bourronat drove in a police buckboard, while I rode with George Voice, the American cowboy before mentioned. He had spent the winter on the Milk River, and gave me a great deal of information which I had not previously had occasion to acquire. We might have saved ourselves a disagreeable trip, for neither of the Spencers was at home, and we had to deal with the manager, William Taylor, who told us that he was also part owner. In reply to Bourronat's communication, he said that his firm had paid duty on every head of stock that they had imported, and that they would not put up a dollar. He told me that the firm then owned 6,000 or 7,000 head of cattle. He could not tell within 1,000, as they had not counted them for some time. It was known to me, at least, that they had paid duty on only 1,230 animals, 854 of which were calves under 12 months of age, and I was more disposed to believe the range gossip which assessed the cattle smuggled from Montana at from 2,000 to 3,000 head. However, there was nothing for us to do but to go home, which we did. Shortly after this I attended a meeting of the Western Stock Growers' Association, and there asked a prominent stockman what it would cost the government to hire a round-up party of 15 riders with the necessary etceteras for 21 days. George Voice had calculated that it would take that length of time to cover the range. Mr. George Lane replied, $1,500, and I then asked if he could supply the party. He said he would. I explained that the proposition was a close secret and must remain so. He finally asked what direction the round up would probably take, and I said southeast. "Then I can guess what your business is," said he. "Keep your guesses to yourself at any rate," I replied, and we parted. In course of time the Customs Department authorized the hiring of the round up, and everything was arranged with such secrecy that the only people in the West who knew anything about it were George Lane, George Voice, my orderly room clerk, and myself. On Wednesday, May 14th, the round up party camped a couple miles east of Lethbridge, and Bourinot and I joined them there. I took my clerk with me, mounted, and took 2 saddle horses for my own use. Bourinot was driven in a light wagon hauled by a police team. The captain of the round up, William Playfair, knew what our errand was, and so did an expert cattle buyer named William Henry, whom Mr. Lane had thoughtfully included in the personnel of his party, but none of the other men knew. It was supposed to be George Lane's horse round up, whose mission ordinarily would be to scour the range for the owner's horses, and it was amusing sometimes to hear remarks as to what was Captain Deane's connection with Lane's horse round up. Voice had been lent to me by the Montana stockman for whom he was working at the time, and brought his own string of horses with him, 10 in number. The other riders were provided with 6 apiece. We should have started earlier in the year, but extensive prairie fires had in the previous autumn devastated a great tract of the country over which we wanted to travel, and so we had to wait until sufficient young grass had grown to provide for our needs. 1902 was the year of bad floods in the West, and our journey was very much delayed by heavy rains, which had the compensating advantage of helping the grass to grow. I should not omit to mention something that happened on our second day out. It was after midday dinner. The camp had been struck, and we were on the point of starting again. Voice had saddled and mounted the horse he had chosen for the afternoon, "the best in the string, but mean," as he described him, when the brute began to buck. He bucked so long and so hard that he finally threw Voice over his head, turned a complete somersault, and broke his neck in the doing of it. When we turned our eyes from Voice, who was shaking himself to see if there was any harm done, we saw his late mount balanced on his rump and on the horn of the saddle, with his feet in the air, and his head where his tail had been, stone dead. He remained in that position until he was pulled over to allow the saddle to be taken from under him. Some weeks later I wrote to his owner in Montana and asked what value he set upon the horse, as he had been killed in our service. In his reply he said, "We lose horses occasionally in about the same manner in which this one acted with Voice, and in all probability we would have lost this one sooner or later, or he might have caused the death of a man. I never regret the loss of a horse that will change ends in that way, and I am thankful George escaped, and the horse is dead. I do not wish any pay for him. With kindest regards, I am yours very truly, John Harris." Voice caught another horse out of the herd and went about his business as if nothing had happened. The chances of changes of a cowboy's life must be seen to be appreciated. At this time we were heading for a ranch on the Manyberries Creek, about 100 miles due east of Lethbridge, and it took us 4½ days to make the journey. On our arrival there I found some men and horses whom I had temporarily withdrawn from my Milk River detachments. There, too, I received a report from a special envoy who had been employed for the previous 6 weeks in watching the Spencer cattle, and this report told me where practically every hoof was to be found. Not a single head was on the Spencers' lease. They were all feeding on the public domain. We now told the men of our party what our errand was, and at 6:30 next morning we all pulled out, the round up to begin business on the nearest cattle they could find, and Bourinot and I to visit the Spencers' ranch, distant about 30 miles. On our way we were held up for a day and a half at Pendant d'Oreille detachment by bad weather and impassable roads, but I saw Mr. Taylor in the interval. He told us that he was very glad the inspection was to take place. It was the very thing he wanted. As the ensuing weeks wore on, Mr. Taylor's gratification visibly declined to the vanishing point. On May 21st, Bourinot and I found Brother John at home at the ranch. He was affability itself. He told me that he "did not know a doggone thing" about the cattle or anything else connected with the ranch. He said Taylor kept what books there were, and he, John Spencer, had never looked at them. He held Taylor responsible. This happened to be election day, and Taylor had gone to vote. We waited at the ranch for him until about 4 o'clock, and then went back to our lodgings. John Spencer promised that Taylor should bring the books for our inspection, and said that we should part good friends, whatever happened, but he could not pretend to say how we might find the cattle, as he knew nothing about them, and had never told a lie in his life. From that time onward, the recording angel had less leisure time in connection with the rancher of pious and patriarchal appearance, who was said, by those amongst whom he had lived for years, to be the crafty member of the firm. Taylor came to see us at Pendant d'Oreille next morning. He brought one book which showed the amount of duty paid on importations from the United States, but told us nothing that I did not know. On the following day, Bourinot and I reached our round up camp just before noon. The party had gathered about 2,500 head of cattle, out of which, in the course of the day, about 400 Americans were cut out and held. The others were handed over to Taylor's men to take and keep out of our way. Next day, similarly, about 140 head of Americans were cut out of a bunch of 600. I may as well here explain how our men were guided in their selection of what I call American cattle. The Spencer brothers had in Montana used certain brands, namely, the double rowlock on the left ribs, and bar 7K and J7 on the left side. They were not allowed to use in Canada the same brands that they had used in the United States. For instance, the Canadian brand for the double rowlock cattle was the double rowlock on the right side instead of the left. Sam Spencer was awarded this brand in that place at his own request. In the same way, Canadian brands were awarded in the case of bar 7K and J7 cattle. This story is not concerned with the particularities of brands, and for the sake of illustrating generally the system in vogue, I will use the case of the double rowlock cattle. An animal bearing that brand on the left ribs was undeniably an animal born and bred in the United States, whether it bore a brand on the right side or whether it did not. It was a common thing to find an American cow with a calf at foot and a yearling heifer or steer following her. Possibly the two offspring bore the Canadian brand without any other at all. This meant that the cow was a smuggled animal. The Spencers would endeavour to call her a stray, that is, a cow which had crossed the imaginary boundary line into Canada without their knowledge or consent. But this claim was defeated by the fact that the cow had been long enough on Canadian soil to have two calves, one over 12 months old, and the other, it may be, only a few weeks old, and the fact that the cow's progeny had been branded with the Spencers' Canadian brand showed conclusively that the cow had been in Canadian territory with their knowledge and consent, and that they had given her some attention, as the two calves were still following their mother at the date of our visit. We noticed many cases of that kind. I have previously said that the Spencers had imported and paid duty on 527 head of calves on April 25, 1900. These calves were sworn to be under 12 months old. That meant that any number of cows from 1,000 to 1,500 in number had been despoiled of their calves for the time being, and that they had been driven into Canada at some other point there to meet their calves. The calves were then carefully branded. The cows were not. Some of the cows were doubtless heavy in calf at the time of their importation, and their then unborn calves would be branded when the branding season should come on and opportunities would offer. The ordinary range expectation in the matter of calf crop was 1 calf to 3 cows or thereabouts. The casualties were so great, arising from wolves, coyotes, weather accidents, indifferent motherhood, etc., that John Spencer's claim that every one of their cows had a calf was a sheer absurdity. Anyhow, we found a goodly number of dry cows in their herd at the close of our visit. I will recur to this question a little later on. Two notable things happened on Saturday, May 24th. The first was that George Lane drove into camp from Medicine Hat, a distance of about 150 miles, to see how his horse roundup was getting on, and told us that he had that morning seen two men, who were evidently anxious to avoid him, riding hard in a northeasterly direction. The second was that in the course of the afternoon I met Art Strong, Sam Spencer's very capable foreman. I had left word in various quarters that I should like to talk to him, and as a result of some such communication he now came to visit our camp. He had formerly been a line rider on the Milk River in the employ of some Montana stock owners, and I knew a good deal of him and about him. I knew, for instance, that although he would serve his employer's interests to the utmost, he would not swear to a lie. I feared from the first that by moving Sam Spencer's cattle he might hinder our inquiry, and I had taken the precaution, before I left Lethbridge, of laying in information and obtaining a warrant for his arrest in connection with the importation of calves in April 1900. I intended to have no scruples in putting him out of harm's way if I should have any reason to suspect him of playing tricks with us. It was this I wanted to tell him. After the usual greetings, I said that I wanted to point out to him that if he took upon himself the task of carrying out the unlawful commands of his employers, he might find a difficulty in devoiding himself of responsibility for the execution of orders which he of necessity knew to be unlawful. I told him I had a warrant in my pocket, but I did not want to execute it unless he obliged me to do so, and I also pointed out that all the Spencer cattle were now under seizure by the Customs Department, and it would be a serious matter for any person to interfere with the due process of law. He said, "They accuse me, don't they, of smuggling 1,000 head of cattle at the Bone Pile in April 1900? I replied, "Yes, that is what they say of you." "Well," he retorted, "I didn't do it. There were only 900 in the bunch anyhow, and after I had cut out the calves for customs entry at Writing on Stone, my orders were to leave the mothers at the line, and I left them there." The Bone Pile, I should say, was a pile of bones which marked the boundary line. Having got such an admission as this from a hostile witness, I thought myself so fortunate that I said, "Oh, well, I'll keep the warrant in my pocket for the present, and I hope you won't give me any occasion to use it." He promised he would not, and we went on our respective ways. Strong's statement about the 900 cattle, if accepted, and I accepted it unreservedly, emphasised the fraudulent nature of the sworn customs entry as to the 527 calves being all under 12 months of age. There must have been among them a considerable number of yearlings which had reached the age of puberty, and were doubtlessly in some cases in the process of becoming mothers themselves. It was no uncommon thing to find on the range a 2-year-old heifer with a calf. End of chapter 15, part 1.